We begin the show with the warning from the United Nations. Harmful global heating emissions are at record levels, and current commitments to slash emissions, particularly by the world's largest polluters, still fall far short. Managing the climate crisis has also become harder because of the war in Ukraine, which has made governments rethink their own clean energy goals. And as our experts have laid out, the ongoing conflict has also led to massive profits for producers of the world's dirtiest fuels.
Well, we've seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the end of February that prices of energy, particularly oil and gas, have soared because there is a fear that supplies of from Russia are going to be cut off in the near future as sanctions take effect. It is not possible to compensate for lower Russian exports very quickly and overnight. There is only a certain amount of spare production capacity available elsewhere in the world, and if there is a significant further reduction in Russian supplies, then I think, inevitably face pressure from rising prices, which is going to pile on to the already difficult economic situation we're facing in many parts of the world.
It seems that in the longer term, Russian oil and gas production is going to decline. Some of the newer projects, particularly like in the Arctic, some of the more technologically difficult projects were going to be done together with the likes of ExxonMobil or BP, who have experience in those kind of harsh conditions. And without the international partner, it's much more difficult for the local companies to implement those projects.
Obviously, for people who are producing oil and gas and selling it, the price has risen enormously and handed them windfall profit. The issue is, what will the companies do with these windfall profits? If they use them to increase investment in all forms of energy, because investment in all forms is still needed, then that would be a good thing. But if they use the windfall profits to either buy back their own shares or to pay higher dividends to shareholders, then that is probably not going to benefit the global energy economy in years to come.
The European companies like BP, Shell, Total Energies, they already have very ambitious plans to invest in renewable energy and invest in things other than oil and gas. And the newly available cash from these extraordinary profits, to some extent, I think will be invested in offshore wind or in solar or in renewable aviation fuel or some of the other things that will reduce their carbon output. The American companies tend to be more pure oil and gas. They're not doing quite so much of this. So there may not be such a big increase in investment on that side of the Atlantic.
In terms of what governments will do, I think they will be facing very, very strong political pressure within their own countries to tax the companies on these so-called windfall profits.
One of the big problems that is often missed in the excitement that these ideas create is that if we take a global company like an Exxon or a BP and you look at the amount of profit that they make, say in the UK or in any one particular jurisdiction, it's actually a very small proportion of the overall profit. Unless there's windfall taxes in all kind of jurisdictions around the world, the actual impact of windfall taxes on these profits is probably going to be limited, because you obviously can't have a windfall tax on profit that was actually created in another country.
Well, let's get more on this now with Faustine Delasalle in Lille, France. She's Vice Chair at the Energy Transitions Commission. We also have Joe Lo in London. He's a reporter at Climate Home News. Welcome to you both. Can I start with you, Joe? At last year's COP26 climate summit in Scotland, we heard countries pledge to deliver stronger commitments to slash their carbon emissions. Are you expecting countries at this year's summit to deliver on those pledges?
Yeah, well, we already know that most of the countries that promised to, all the countries promised to increase their climate pledges, but so far, very few of them have. Australia, Chile, Indonesia, a handful. So they haven't so far. There are a few countries which are expected to announce better pledges at this conference. But just because they're not updating their official climate plans doesn't mean they're not doing anything on climate. The US has just passed its most ambitious climate legislation ever, and other countries are kind of quietly working on the details. So it's not all doom and gloom, but a lot more work to do.
Okay, Faustine, tensions between rich polluting countries and those poorer countries that are suffering from the richer countries' emissions are expected to be a main feature at this year's COP27 in Egypt. How do you expect that issue of climate reparations to play out at this year's summit?
I think it's going to be center stage, obviously, given that the COP is taking place in Africa this year. And so the topic of reparations and loss and damages was already brought up quite powerfully in Glasgow last year, but will be even more so this year. What I think also needs to be brought up in the relationship between developed economies and emerging and low-income economies in this COP as well is how developed economies can help lower-income economies invest in their own energy transition as well. I think we really need to look at both sides, the adaptation side, but also, most importantly, the energy transition side in both developed and developing countries.
Yes, I do want to talk to you about energy transition in a moment. But Joe, we know that this decade-old promise to essentially commit $100 billion in annual climate financing by 2020 has essentially failed. No country has really lived up to that. But they have pledged to double their adaptation finance by 2025. Do you expect countries at this year's summit to actually stick to those commitments, given the fact that we are staring or looking at the prospect of a global recession?
Yeah, I mean, we won't find out at this COP, if they're going to meet those targets. We'll have to wait till 2025. But there's going to be huge pressure on them to deliver more finance. And we will see some announcements definitely at this COP. But also definitely won't be enough, and it won't be enough to, the needs are growing. We just saw in Pakistan those huge floods, very expensive to rebuild after that. And yeah, so it won't be enough. We've also got the Republicans about to take control of Congress, and they've been the major bloc on climate finance globally, really. So not looking good over there.
Okay, and Faustine, energy transition is obviously your specialty. Can you explain to us how much is electricity production responsible for global heating at the moment, and how would you describe the progress that's being made to transition away from those dirty fossil fuels to cleaner renewable sources of energy?
Look, at this point in time, electricity is roughly 20% of the global energy mix. So in the grand scheme of things, it does contribute a significant portion of CO2 emissions, but there are other sectors like industry, mobility, that also contribute very significantly to emissions globally. And so we need to tackle emissions in the power sector through a shift to renewables, but we also need to tackle emissions in sectors that are not yet electrified, like road transport, aviation, shipping, heavy industry. And those two things need to progress simultaneously. And I think to do that, the key is massive investment in renewable energy, because in one shape or form, even those sectors that are not today electrified will probably rely on electricity in one shape or form in the future, including via green hydrogen. And therefore, massive investment in renewable electricity is what matters right now. The good news on that front is that cost competitiveness of renewable electricity versus fossil fuels is increasingly strong across multiple countries. And the energy crisis has accentuated that cost competitiveness in some regions as well over the past months. So my hope is that we can see continued massive investment in renewable energy and even a ramp up in the months to come, as Joe said earlier, regardless of what is officially pledged at COP.
Okay, and Joe, the war in Ukraine really has exposed how heavily dependent the world still is on fossil fuels like natural gas and oil. We've got rich countries in Europe stockpiling natural gas ahead of the winter and finding new alternative sources that don't come from Russia. We also have countries like the United States urging oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia to ramp up their output in order to reduce oil prices. The world really still is heavily dependent on these fossil fuels, aren't they? Do you see that changing anytime soon?
Depends how soon you're talking about. The world is relying on fossil fuels, and I think that the foolishness of that has been shown by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how that's caused problems for Europe. I think in the next year or two, Europe, like you say, is looking for gas. I think after that, they're trying to get off it as quick as possible, and so they don't have to be in the pocket of any foreign gas producer, whether it's Vladimir Putin or somebody else. And I think at this COP, we're really going to see some of the major gas producers trying to present gas as a transition fuel rather than the fossil fuel that it is. Egypt is a big gas producer, and I think that's the narrative they'll be going with. But the International Energy Agency has predicted that we've basically reached peak gas, or we will do at least by 2030, and then it's a kind of steady decline, or at least a plateau from there.
Okay, we will see how this summit unfolds over the next 2 weeks. On that note, Joe Lo and Faustine Delasalle, really appreciate your time and analysis. Thank you again for joining us.